My name is Austin Graff. I'm the director of the University Writing Program, and working closely with PLA to do these workshops. So today's topic is teaching analysis, moving students from analysis to synthesis. So let's start by asking synthesis for what? And specifically, what do we mean by synthesis? When you're talking about teaching students synthesis, what are you talking about teaching them to do? That's a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I know in some, I'm sure it's many things. I think one of the things that it is figuring out how to take information and use it as a means of driving, your purposes in writing. So you have something that you want to do with writing, you need some evidence to put that forth, and so how are you going to integrate the information you have for those purposes? And I was thinking of, I don't know, does that get us somewhere?
I don't know. Does that get us somewhere?
Yeah. I can say that, I've been doing a lot of conferences this week with my students and looking at their writing. And an interesting thing emerged, which is that they were organizing these within a paragraph, they're organizing the evidence as like, and now I'm going to use some information from this source. Right. And now I'm going to use some information from this one. And meanwhile, like one of the topics, which was local foods, there was a little bit of local here and a little bit of local there, and it was just this jumbled mess because they just were let me just use a source here, and I was talking to them about synthesis in that context.
Anyone want to add?
Because I made some attempts at trying to explicitly teach synthesis, which is challenging.
Yeah.
And I think the way it was in an ethics class, where students were looking at different ethical frameworks, utilitarianism or consequentialism or virtue ethics. And so I'd have them take one ethical, one situation and look at it from those different perspectives. And when I tried to tell them synthesis was in that situation was kind of drawing connections between different things and then being attentive to the new things that emerge from that. So, so I think it's really kind of making connections between things and then being aware of what new ways of thinking about that.
I think it's encouraging a kind of recursive back and forth process between the particular and the general, and then back down to the particular, back to the general. And speaking about conferences, I just came from a conference with two students who are working together on a project. And I think it's a fairly challenging project now that I've seen students working on it. I think some students will have a better grasp on it than others. But essentially what they're required to do is they're required to understand a social issue in terms of multiple stakeholders' perspectives. And of course, the entry point into that project is finding articles, right? But what I'm noticing the students do is, like you're saying, is that they get hung up on what a particular article is saying, when sometimes the nugget that might be taken away from a single article is just one line, but it connects so beautifully with something else in another article. And so getting them to see this big picture emerge as they're piecing together puzzles is hard and it's challenging. And so that's for me the responsibility of teaching synthesis, but also a challenge.
Yeah, I would think too, for me it means putting the pieces back together in a certain way that tells your story. So you have to, back to images, you kind of have to have an idea of the story that you want to tell. Another colleague of mine one time used to talk about it as a weaving, right? And is it the warp and the weft? Is that the two pieces? Yeah. So, and that's just, so for me it's image, but it is difficult to teach that, and that's definitely why I'm here.
Yeah.
For me, it's circling back, because I'm dealing with students in Capstone and thinking about taking all this disparate evidence, figuring out what are the salient facts that move the storyline forward, and then also bringing your own your own work into a larger context. So for me, it's always the circling motion.
And these are, I mean, so there are some things that I'm hearing that I want to bring out. So one thing that I'm hearing is this: synthesis is the idea of putting things together. Another thing that I'm hearing is that part of doing synthesis is breaking things apart. Right? You must do analysis in order to do synthesis. Part of the process of synthesis is finding out what the pieces are so that you can put them into connection with the other pieces. And another piece about this, and this is, it's a question I'd love to ask students, is whether or not they can make knowledge. And synthesis is the process by which they make new knowledge. So Dan, I think you said, they're attentive to the new connections that come up, the new ideas that come up, right? This is synthesis of making something new, making something that wasn't there before. And so helping students to see that this, it's their own personal act of creation. That's kind of cool. And it's really, really challenging. So what I'm going to ask you to do right now is individually, would you list academic tasks that you do that require synthesis? So not just writing articles, but what sections of articles that you write require synthesis. Academic tasks you ask students to do that require synthesis. And non-academic tasks, either that you or that people you know do that require synthesis. So take a few minutes to just make your own individual list. What I'm going to ask you to do is, on this side, pair up, and on this side, trio. And first, combine your lists. And then group the tasks on your combined list in whatever way makes sense to you. All right? Put them together in some way that makes sense to you. Label your groups, so come up with titles for your groups. And prepare to report out about the groups that you made, how you formed and labeled them, and what you learned about synthesis from grouping, labeling, and from grouping and labeling.
Now, as groups, you want us to group our lists.
Correct. So first come up with a complete list from the pair of you, a combined list from the pair of you.
One
or the
list or
three of you.
three?
So you two are coming up with one list, and then your one list of all the synthesis tasks. Then you,
I'm talking about the
oh, maybe that's best, yeah.
Okay, sure.
Combine, so you combine one list of the two of you, or Dan, you can start by working with them. And then group them in any way that makes sense to you, although probably not in the groups that I already gave you, but in some other way that makes sense to you. Title your groups, and see what insights that gives you about synthesis. All right, go. And I know you probably didn't get as far as you would have liked to have gotten, but let's hear what you came up with. What ideas came up for you, what groups you came up with, how you labeled them, what struggles you had, etc.
We, so our groups were planning and summarizing building, /building, determining course of action, and identifying takeaways for the groups that.
And so what, for instance, was in your planning group?
Or what activities were in our planning group? Things like scheduling courses along with instructors is a planning activity. Developing a grant proposal is a planning activity.
Preparing lesson plans, preparing activities. And I think what was really neat is we sort of started sharing our list. We had roughly the same number of items in each category that you had provided us, and then about midway through the process, sort of starts, right away you can see the wheels turning, and it's like, well, maybe these two things go together. And that really helped because then I started to think along those lines, and so we arrived at our new categories fairly quickly, and I think we found it satisfying to do that. So for instance, I think we realized that each of the tasks that we do is kind of hinged on a type of outcome that we want, and those outcomes were to some extent generalizable. So for example, under non-academic tasks, one of the things that I've written was, I use synthesis, I think, in figuring out how to act in relationships, how to interact. And what I do there is I think about the person's past behaviors. I think about what I know about this person's personality. I think about what my own needs are, what I know about my personality, and I sort of work that all into what is the most appropriate response in this particular situation. And so that seemed like a very action-oriented kind of thing, but sort of also had, what were your action-oriented items? I'm working on automotive problems.
Right, yeah, dealing with automotive.
So in very different contexts, but I think the outcome was really decision-making. So this has helped us with decision-making, and so that was our process.
That's fascinating.
And I'll just remind us, as I'm thinking about this, that we're talking about these things as though we're conscious of everything. But in point of fact, right, we're conscious of almost nothing of our mind's output. And so we can pretend that we're actually aware of all this stuff. But for instance, in your working with relationships, right, the vast majority of that work, of course, is happening well below consciousness, and it and all of that feeds into your conscious reflection on, as does the hierarchies of the automotive problems.
And those who are not practiced in making decisions in relationships may well need to consciously go through those steps in order to be able to internalize them and work unconsciously through it. And so that's a great way to think about this.
Yes.
Is that there's a lot of synthesis that we do without thinking about it, that we may need conscious practice in doing in order to get there.
And explicit conscious practice.
Yeah. Thank you. But you two or three, what'd you come up with? And I'm just gonna.
Our conversation sort of led us to thinking about, at least it's me to thinking about Vygotsky's abstract versus concrete, and the idea that the concrete types of synthesis are local. I was thinking about Julie had a great example of the laundry list, the grocery list, choosing a book at the library that you know what's in your fridge and what's not in your fridge, and you're synthesizing that information, right? But that as you move to the abstract, for example, if you're trying to synthesize ideas you see in an article and frame it in such a way that a third person is understanding it, then it's much, much, much more complex because you're trying to follow a very abstract sort of process of synthesis. And we think we agree kind of the happy medium would be something like a personal statement or a scholarship application where you're taking a list of experiences from your resume and you're trying to run it through the lens of the prompt. Anything to add to that?
No, I think too, it's just the very, very concrete, tasks to the very, very abstract. And my suggestion was there is sort of this middle ground where you're writing about yourself or you're reflecting reflection papers or things you can build on with some local knowledge, but that helps in the practice, I think, of this.
And did that bring you to any insights about synthesis?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I had never thought about those everyday tasks, those non-academic tasks. And I work in a field that's very applied, it's a very applied profession, so we're pretty concrete, I think, in a way. And for students for whom, maybe it's a hook into the teaching of it, and I had never thought of that.
Yeah, I absolutely did, and because I said, when we normalize it, when we name it, it becomes a thing, and I thought, I never really thought about teaching it this way and saying, these are all acts of synthesis. So again, it brings students to that awareness of it brought me to an awareness of what I was doing. As you said, a lot of this is intuitive. It's just things, it's ways of being and doing, as James G. will say, that you just learn to do in the process of your academic growth. But to explicitly name it and talk about it as a thing, I think it would be an absolutely fabulous way of modeling it for students.
Go ahead, yes. Take it, because we struggled with this. We did not know what you were asking for. So I could see, how my students, when I say an assignment, that they're just blanking. So but we kind of something rose to the top, and it was, we were talking about following a recipe and how that is different and how that is paralleled in the way we help students hone in on a topic for their research paper or their capstone. It's more like an exploratory, fun, replenishing act of synthesis, where you're sort of taking the inspirational or aspirational parts of, like, this is a recipe I've been dying to try, and then you go and you look in the fridge and you have nothing. So then you're dealing, or nothing that relates to that. So you're dealing with the students also sort of aspirational thoughts about, I really want to study this, or I want to do my paper on this, but then we realize that doesn't quite mesh with reality, with what they have on the ground in terms of the resources that they can do this research on. So we sort of grouped it in terms of this aspirational, replenishing, exploratory synthesis. And then we had more synthesis within the confines of other limitations. For instance, writing a grant, so you have to write very specifically, you have to follow the guidelines of what the grant's asking, what their goals are, and also what the time frame. And that is also in the same category as arranging kids' schedules, planting a school garden, because it's very much, people think of that as very inspirational, but it's actually, you have to think about when these students are going to be in class and in session, and making sure that you have something always ready for them to harvest or interact with in the garden. So that seemed like a real constrained type of synthesis. Helping fulfilling the requirements of a paper, having students really work on the writing to the specific requirements of that paper, so in their synthesis. And then we had the emergency.
We started
situation.
thinking about time frame, like synthesis you have to do in a split second, because that's all, you got 5 seconds to make it happen. Something goes, it's not planned, or there's an emergency, and like suddenly you have to think of it all at once and have a good, some good outcome, versus, when you just have a lot of time to make it happen, and so thinking temporarily about something.
And did you come into any insights about synthesis from this process?
I think one thing.
Your discussions were great as I was listening.
Yeah, we were probably like, oh my God, I don't understand this. What do we do? But I think one of the things that we were talking about that I found really interesting was we were thinking about, coming from that place where the inspiration is there. So let's just kind of go off of an earlier theme that Mr. was talking about. And then there's this kind of the reality on the other side, and how do you bring those two things together to come up with something that lets you push forward, with, you're able to move forward on something, with this moment of, oh, what do I do? place where you can keep moving.
And one of the things that was really interesting to me about your descriptions was when you talked about the recipe and you said, well, you look in the refrigerator and none of the ingredients are there. I realized, well, first thing is you have to know where to look, right, for the ingredients, right? Which ingredients do you look for in the fridge, and which ingredients do you look for in the pantry, and which ingredients do you look for? And
Listening to you two gave me an epiphany, and that was, you know, I do a lot of creating in my job, but not most of it's not connected to anything aesthetically pleasing. And, no, and so there's a lot of creating, but there's not a lot of creativity. But in synthesis, right, a lot of synthesis is creativity in a certain context. For instance, making a great grant proposal, right? You're in the box of the proposal and you've got to do all this stuff, but you've also got to do something that's attractive. Because it won't, without it, it won't catch anybody's
Good
eye.
title.
Anyway, that was something that,
But even, you know, even scheduling, which seems like the maximally constrained exercise, right? There is creativity in that. And, you know, a lot of what we think of as logic problems are synthesis problems, right?
Yes.
And so,
And they also go through the same, I mean, sometimes like I was thinking about children's schedules, I remember thinking, as my son's grown and gone, but at one point, you know, there were 4 different academic schedules, UC Santa Cruz, CSUMB, CSU Fresno, my son's school, and I was trying to bring them all together and kind of organize my life for 6 months in advance, when some universities don't want to think more than a month ahead. And going crazy, but then, you know, there's that point of frustration, just like when they're writing a paper, point of frustration. Lately, I've been seeing the students come to class with a smile on their face, because I keep saying, you found the sweet spot. You found that point where your ideas are coming together, and you're really excited about your topic. It's not just a labor where you're overwhelmed. And that, I think, speaks to your point about creativity, because that's when you've creatively figured a way of synthesizing, and there's an inherent joy in it.
and I think, you know, one of the points that's important there that connects with Sawyer's point is that it becomes joyful when it's unconscious, when you're not having to pay attention to the steps. When you're having to pay attention to the steps, it can be really a struggle.
Yeah.
And so that I think is interesting. Did you, other insights that came out from hearing each other?
There was
Go
just
ahead.
one other
Yes,
point
sorry.
that I thought of, which is, you know, we were talking about this gap between the inspiration and the practicality. And so one of the things that we started talking about in that cooking example was, well, what's happening when you're trying to bridge the gap? And we also had an academic example of that too. But in the cooking example, you know, I might have this recipe that has no ingredients or very few ingredients from what I have, but you know, how I'm bridging the gap is I start looking at a couple of other recipes that do involve those ingredients and then relate that in some way to the, you know, the original. So it's kind of that process of what are you doing in the middle to bridge the gap that helps the synthesis process?
2 things came to mind when you were speaking. One was when you and Nelson were talking about the joy piece, and it's sort of what I heard was you said when you don't have to struggle with the process kind of consciously anymore, it just comes. And I think of that term mimesis, which I don't know enough about, but which I'm learning a little bit more about. But to me, that speaks to that. Mimesis is like when you're just everything is coming all together and you're not thinking through it anymore. When I teach social work students to do practice, of course they have to know the theory. Of course they have to know the skill. Of course they have to watch themselves, you know, reflection. But mimesis is when you're no longer doing that so consciously, you're just practicing, right? And now these students have just got ready to graduate and thinking they're about there and they're thinking they're about there. So that was interesting to me when I think about synthesis in other ways as well. And then when you guys were talking about your grouping, I wonder whether it's in your temporal thing. I wonder if it's an emergency or planful, if the process is really any different for any of us. And then I got to thinking, so does that mean it's a process very unique to each of us that is developmental somehow or develops, you know? I don't know, but I wondered if in an emergency the process is any different for some of us than it's really.
would guess yes. And partly it depends on how much practice you have with the process and with compressing the process, right? Because there are people who don't respond well in emergencies.
Yeah,
They don't know how to bring things together. And there are other, and some of that may be dispositional, and some of it may have to do with their practice with those skills and processes.
Few of us practice being in emergency. No, I'm right, seriously.
Yeah.
Well, it involves different biochemistry, involves different parts of the brain,
Yeah.
and so there certainly has to be a difference, because I think you're employing different things in your body to make those things happen.
Right, which gets back to how you meet things.
Yeah.
How you meet these processes from.
Yeah.
Or for every individual. Yeah, I'm thinking of the idea of focal versus peripheral memory. And how, when you have a new process, it takes so much cognitive, it's a great cognitive load, and you can't do as much or for as long, and then it becomes more and more familiar. It goes to peripheral. Your mimesis made me think of that.
Right, I was writing on the same stuff.
Yeah.
There's drills on the soccer field, that's not poetry in motion, right?
No.
It's when it's mastered that, and unconscious that it's all flowing.
Yeah.
And right, actually playing the game
Yes.
is an act of synthesis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Jane, you were trying to get in.
Yeah, I think as I'm listening to all this, I'm also there's also the ILO stuff too. The relationship between synthesis and critical thinking. So and part of it is like working with students and giving them these kind of frameworks and things to think about that makes sense to them, and just synthesis a part of critical thinking, a piece of it.
Well, there's student perspective, right? They're assembling their perspective out of pieces.
But it's this word that we throw out all the
Yeah.
time. We talk about critical thinking all the time, but they're never used together in
Yeah.
the same framework. And so,
It's-
like when you look at the critical thinking rubric, I don't think the word synthesis
No,
appears.
it's not in there
What
much.
do you think it is in the descriptors?
I think
In some of the
yeah.
descriptors.
Oh, right, no, it is
But-
in one of
right.
the scriptures, yeah.
But it's there in a bunch of the areas, right? Because, so for instance,
I know.
looking at attending to bias,
Yeah.
right, you've got to understand, I think anytime you have to separate things into pieces and then look at the interactions between them and then bring them back together,
That's synthesis.
that's
Yeah.
synthesis.
Right, but then it's getting to like, how do you teach this to students?
Right.
And I think Nelson's been as part of it, you kind of think about these everyday things that you do.
Yeah.
And becoming more aware of these other everyday things that you do with critical thinking synthesis and helping them become more, develop more cognitive understanding of
Right.
that.
Right.
That's maybe one avenue, but it's raising some really interesting questions about pedagogy and framing for students. And I have to leave, and I'm really have to drag myself.
We cut a video in.
And Robin, I apologize for putting you on the spot, but you came in sort of in the midst of this. Did anything jump out at you from what you were hearing?
Well, actually, I was just forming in my mind that my experience is actually an example of synthesis, because I'm waiting to arrive to that tipping point where I understand what you're talking about. You know what I mean? I'm coming in and I'm hearing some pedagogical issues and I'm hearing some personal experiential issues, and I'm waiting for it to all come together in my mind. But it does really parallel the student's experience. When the student walks into the room and we are the experts, and we're using language they may not be familiar with. I was just thinking how much I avoid actually using pedagogical language with my students, and the reasons I don't. And it's just been interesting to see that it is taking me some time. And I understand synthesis. I use synthesis all the time in my course, and I speak to synthesis. But how interesting to understand that we must amass a certain level of information before we can even enter the conversation. And that's the experience of our students. And we're talking about helping them learn how to bring these things together, whether it's the analogy is an emergency or the analogy is they have time and preparation to plan. But it all comes to the same issue. What tools do they need to sit at the table, to understand the conversation?
Thanks for coming.
Bye, Dan.
So these were some things that I came up with of what synthesis does. And I heard so many more in your conversations, but you can establish chronology using synthesis, right? You know, that's what happens all the time in courtrooms, right? They try to establish a chronology of what happened, or in, you know, those police procedurals. They take all these different reports and try to put them together to make a chronology. It creates a conversation, and this is one of the things that students have a real challenge with, is recognizing that ideas are in conversation with each other, but they may be in conversation without ever referring to each other. And so that when students are bringing these things together, they are actually creating a conversation, not just finding a conversation. And so that's, it establishes a territory. This is the Swales model of what a research paper introduction does. Is it sort of, you know, what does the field look like? What does the knowledge about this topic look like in such a way that there's a place for me to insert myself, right? That's part of the, and that's an act of synthesis. Explores an issue or a problem. Sometimes if you are asking students to write a synthesis paper, they're not necessarily adding anything new to the conversation. What they're doing is they're using the conversation to understand the situation, to understand the problem. And for students who are accustomed to very thesis-driven writing, that can be very difficult. That notion of synthesizing for the purpose of inquiry, for the purpose of understanding, not for the purpose of making an argument, can be very challenging. Illuminates multiple perspectives, reveals subtle agreements, disagreements. I'd love I could add Swarup and Mridula's whole list to things that it does, right? Because your list was about, you know, the goals of synthesis, and so I don't think we need to talk more about others, but it's really important to think about the fact that it's not just one thing, and to help students see that it's not just one thing. It does a lot of things. It's a process that we use to accomplish a lot of different purposes. So, a lot of this comes from this book, The Informed Writer, and there'll be a link to this at the end of the slide, and I'll share this slide show with all of you. But steps for synthesis. First thing you have to do is identify a subject or a topic or a problem that you're going to start to gather information about, or identify a goal that you're going to try and achieve. You know, so I loved when I went by and saw Esther had a dinner party or an event, and that was just, I mean, what a brilliant example of synthesis that I hadn't thought of, but it is. It's, you know, so here's this goal. I'm trying to make something, and so what are the pieces that I have to bring together to do that? And then find sources. So identify various perspectives or resources, ingredients. Find a variety, evaluate and select among sources. You know, so do I want to use cocoa powder? Do I want to use baking chocolate? Because chocolate is my center of my examples for everything. And then they have to prepare to synthesize. All right, it's not just something they do. It's something, and this is the mistake. When I was doing this, I realized how often, when I ask students to do research, to write a research paper, I just say, well then, you know, put your sources into conversation. Well, they can't do that because they haven't done the steps before that. And so these steps of preparing to synthesize, to analyze the individual sources, to look for patterns across sources, and those patterns are dependent on the purposes for which you're going to use synthesis. To avoid simplistic pro-con, That is, avoid setting people up as just in opposition to each other. Where do they agree? If they are really in disagreement with each other, then they must agree on what's at issue, at least. They may not agree on what's at issue. And so where is their agreement? And then draw inferences. And this is the part that we typically assign, we typically ask students to represent their inferences and patterns without ever asking them to go through the process before it. So that, I think, was one of the sort of key insights for me in preparing for this, was really to think about, okay, where am I setting students up to do all of these things? I'm just expecting them to do them on their own, in their heads, and then write something. I want to ask, so when I asked you to start putting together your lists, and what I heard Mridula say is that you started talking about things, and Swaroop said, well, this is sort of like that. How did that happen?
Well,
Yeah,
right. The answer, I guess, is I don't know.
Yeah.
But something she said that appealed to, this goes with, so, right, that was synthesis in action, right? In that we have disparate parts,
Right.
and I'm seeing a relationship between them.
And then you two had to talk about what that relationship was, right? So even if the initial recognition that there was a pattern was unconscious, you had to go through a conscious process of then saying, all right, what is this connection,
Right.
right? And how about the rest of you? What processes did you go through?
I just felt like listening to her going through her process, her thought process of how she figured out what to cook. I just started making a parallel in terms of this is how we help students figure out their research topics. So there was a certain amount of transfer and synthesizing that was going on in terms of making those parallels and seeing those patterns between very disparate situations.
Yeah.
I think there were times where we were forming sentences and figuring out whether we were forming the same sentence. And then if we got to one of those, we're like, yeah!
I'm impressed, as in this conversation, at the amount of metaphor that's going on. It's like every third word, because that allows the comparisons,
Right.
That allows us to represent the inferences and patterns.
Yeah.
But it's just, I mean, if you listen carefully, it's phenomenal, the amount of metaphor that just jumps out.
in fact, that's even made me wonder if at the heart of synthesis is the process of detecting analogies. But then I'm trying to test that assumption against what might be exceptions to the rule.
And
I'm thinking there are times when it's not just about analogies, but it's fitting pieces of the puzzle together.
speaking of analogies.
Yeah.
But I just want to say that I was very poetic. The heart of synthesis might be detecting analogies.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But it certainly is pattern recognition, right?
Right.
Whether it's similarities or disjunctions, or it is pattern recognition. You can't find whether a piece is going to fit into a puzzle unless you can recognize the shapes. And so it's that practice of pattern recognition that is an important part of this, if I can get my computer to work. So how do we teach students for that missing piece, right? How do we teach students to prepare to synthesize? And the answer is in a lot of ways. And we need to do all of them.
Right.
So you can build a culture of comparison, to go to your point, Mridula, in classroom talk. I'm sorry?
I just sneezed,
sneezed.
sorry.
Oh, Gesundheit. So look for similarities and differences. So when you find positions that seem to disagree, ask students, well, where do they agree? How strong is this disagreement? Is there, are they agreeing on the issue? So start when there are different perspectives, help students start to see the commonalities in those perspectives. And then when there are similar perspectives, help students see the differences. So frame, and that's a question of asking questions in classroom talk. Those are the questions that you ask them. Begin with pairs of texts. So yesterday we read this article, today we're reading this article, today we're talking about this article. How is this similar to that? What does this add to your understanding from that? How does it differ? If you were to make a comparison between these articles, what would you say? If you were to say that these two articles are talking about one thing, what would you call that thing? So you build the skill of synthesis by starting small and then adding on. And choose different focuses for comparison. So in science, or social science, education, communication research, right? People use different methodologies, right? You can make the comparison in terms of the methodology. You can make the comparison in terms of the conclusions. You can make the comparison in terms of the population studied. You can make the comparisons in terms of the writing style. I mean, it all depends on what your focus is, but we need students to understand that when they are bringing sources together, they bring sources together for different purposes. And that, for instance, if I'm writing the methods section of an article, I bring together sources to justify the methods that I'm using. And in order to do that, I have to look for people who either are using similar methods, or are talking about those methods. But that doesn't involve looking at their conclusions at all. And it may involve looking at the questions that they're asking, because I want to make sure that my question is similar to their question. But all of that involves sort of starting to take a look at the text that we're asking students to read from different perspectives, from different directions. I want to pause there and ask if there are any questions about those few so far. If anything's puzzling about that.
No questions, but I do get that feeling, just thinking like, thank God some students have just been able to get it. Because I haven't done much in the way of really helping.
Well, this is, I mean, what really, again, and this is the same, that's the same for me, is I haven't really consciously done this. And I think, gosh, how did my students want anything from me? And part of it is, some of them get it. Some of them do it accidentally. Some of them get feedback from me that directs them into it, or they conference with me and figure it out through that conversation. But how much better if I can institutionalize this in my class, that this is something that we're all practicing all the time. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just had an interesting epiphany. Going back to a conversation I had with a friend years ago, who's a competition horse guy, and was talking about training this horse. And it was clear from the questions that I was asking that I didn't understand much about what was going on. And he said, well, horses have to want to do this. This thing, for instance, racehorses. The horses that become racehorses only do it because they want to race. They're hungry to race. Not all horses are. The ones that end up being great are the ones that have a big drive to do it and then get training. This is humans are all about pattern. If you look at, nothing is more wired into human evolution than a search for pattern. Frequently, we're wrong. Right? We're wrong about the pattern that we're recognizing. Right? We see a pattern that's not there. But we're all about pattern. And so our work here is just to make explicit stuff that every human is already awesome at. They can't be a functional human without being great at recognizing pattern.
If they're paying attention. So for very often what happens is, students do a reading for one day, and then they put that reading out of their minds the next day.
It's not important to them.
Right.
They're paying attention to the stuff that's important to them.
Exactly. Like the clothes of the person that they're
Attracted to.
yes.
And, it's funny you should say that because I saw this show Cosmos with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he was talking about humans seeking patterns. It was really a nice way of describing it. And then he said, and sometimes humans seek patterns in places where they're not.
Right.
Because it's so, endemic in our drive is
Yes.
looking for that pattern, even if it's the pattern of the clothes of the person doing
Right.
it.
Esther, you were trying to.
Oh, I was just saying that I do consciously do this,
Oh, great.
but only in one of my courses. So it's like, and I struggle with the fact that I'm okay, we're gonna be comparing these two articles that are fair, or these two writers who are on the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of their belief systems. But the thing is, they've already put that other author out of
Right.
mind, because they're
Off
churning
the
through
nose
6
thing.
courses,
Yeah.
So part of it is really hard for them to maintain the level of depth of interest that I have. So,
Well, we're gonna get there because there are some tools that we can use for that.
yeah, helping them retain it so
Right.
that they can.
Right.
That's one of the things I like about your paired text suggestion,
Yeah.
because inherent in the model is the acknowledgement that is important to always have something against which to think.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very helpful.
And then highlight patterns, highlight synthesis in class readings. So if they're reading academic articles, they're reading synthesis. If they're reading, most of what they're reading includes some kind of synthesis. Where do they see it? Can we point to where authors are synthesizing, why authors are synthesizing, how authors are synthesizing? Can we ask them to notice it? All right, and then, and this is anyone who's been in a workshop with me has heard me talk about metacognitive conversation. Asking students how they did that. How did you find that comparison? What did you notice? How did you pick that up? Constantly making strategic thinking a part of the conversation in the class makes those strategies available to everyone. So, when I asked Rory, well, how did you notice that these two things were similar? And he sort of, well, I don't know. And then, but then we got to, well, you may have noticed that there was a similarity, but then you had to talk about what kind of similarity it was. So, anyway, that's and then in small groups, you could ask them to create skits to put authors in conversation, where they have to embody authors. That's a way for them to practice synthesis. And practice grouping and drawing inferences. So exactly what we did with types of synthesis, you can do in all kinds of, with all kinds of things that will be more natural to students. And you can ask them to, in groups, look at articles to analyze where they synthesize and how they synthesize. And again, that's, it depends on how much time you want to spend on those skills, but these are strategies that you can use, and that's all this is about. It's not even saying that you should do all these things, but that these are tools you can use and figure out how much value you can get out of it. I think in terms of content courses, what's really valuable about this is that it helps students to start to see the content as part of a conversation. That it's not disconnected ideas, but it is a community of people who are building knowledge together, which is kind of a cool thought.
I would very much so. That's fantastic.
And that they are resources for each other.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's, yeah, I mean, the metacognitive conversation is key because they start to recognize that they can learn from each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
So actually, I wanted to give you a chance to do a little bit of looking at synthesis in an article. So ignore the abstract, but if you start on the back of the first page, the introduction, even in those first 3 paragraphs, just take a look in those first 3 paragraphs in pairs. Where do you see synthesis? What is it for? How is it done? How did the author mark the synthesis? So I heard, I think, all of the groups talking first about the most obvious examples of synthesis. What were the most obvious examples of synthesis?
Use of sources.
Okay, use of sources. Were all the use of sources for the same purpose? No. What were the different purposes for the use of sources?
One, I think, is just kind of setting the stage, so giving a little bit of an understanding of the context and where authors have come together and found some similar patterns.
Okay.
And then kind of moves to building the points that are going to lead to the insertion.
Yeah, just rephrase what I think I understood, is that, so there's providing context and then there's making the case for the specific study you're doing. I think sources can be leveraged with both of those.
I mean, I find this very interesting because there are a lot of places where the authors they make a claim, they make a statement, and then there is a source afterwards, which I would tell my students not to do, because they're not distinguishing between what is their idea and what is the source's idea. And so some of it, the source is sort of, they're borrowing credibility for their own idea by saying, well, someone else thought this too. And then some of it is, I think, setting up that knowledge context into which they're placing their study. And then other is sort of building up the sort of territory into which their study fits.
But Nelson, wouldn't you say that that's part of the genre of this kind of
Yes.
writing? Because that's what I do teach my students to do.
To do it without acknowledging the sources?
No,
I mean, just,
to use the sources to make your argument.
right. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, to increase credibility. Whereas you're saying they're not distinguishing between their own and the. Yeah, that's a kind of interesting point, because I remember there was a couple of articles I've projected on the overhead or the wall for students to kind of look at, where halfway through the sentence, the source is mentioned, and in the second half of the sentence, I said, so here's the author referring to this point, and here's the author actually diverging and adding his own ideas, kind of making that distinction. But I see that, that's pretty sophisticated.
And that's also APA.
Yeah.
I think in MLA, you put the source at the end of the sentence, whether the whole sentence is from the source or not.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. So
I'm
that,
more familiar with this.
Okay.
yeah, I mean, that's what the struggle is sometimes teaching students, because really trying to, actually the conversation you and I had about 2 weeks ago, where I said it's really,
It's very complicated
yeah,
to
and
think
how
about
you're
this.
using it. Which
And,
is,
and,
yeah.
and this is, there's only one instance of attributive language,
Mhm.
right? Researchers have found.
Mhm. Mhm.
And So that's, obviously that's okay, right? Obviously this is fine, but it's worth paying attention to because in some context it wouldn't be.
It's really interesting to hear you say that because I remember this precise moment into which I was kind of indoctrinated into this way of writing.
Yeah.
It was very early on in my graduate program, and what I tended to do was I tended to start my sentences with, Smith and
Right.
somebody else,
Right.
1995 said this, and I remember my professor telling me it's much more conventional to formulate the sentence and then put your parentheses at the end.
Yeah.
And so I started to train myself to do that. And,
Yeah.
So I'm curious, do you see here an instance of what you were talking about in terms of something that seems dubiously, or like a sentence that appears like a claim that the authors are making that might mislead one into thinking that it's...
I think that it's about genre awareness,
Okay.
right? I think it's about knowing that this author is following a certain set of conventions that allow framing the sentences in that way. And that's, we switch between those conventions easily and naturally, but students may not. And so students may see the sentence with the citation at the end and think that that's the author's point of view.
Can I ask you to just go back a bit? You said ask students to not simply borrow credibility by following a claim as a source rather than build territory. Can you speak to that a bit? Because I too tell students to lead with their own assertions and follow with evidence. But you're saying something different. You're suggesting something deeper, I think. Can you speak to that for a moment?
Well, I think there are different uses of the sources here, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So sometimes the author is making, or the authors are making their own argument, or their own sort of general statements, and backing those up by citing sources.
Right.
And sometimes the authors are talking about what has been studied and found so far, which is about setting out the territory.
Okay.
But then once we pass those uses of synthesis, then it gets much more subtle, right? But there's still lots of synthesis going on. And Mridula, would you talk about the first few sentences that made me so happy?
The series of questions that are particular examples then leads the authors into making an observation which sets up the stage. So they take, it's sort of a process of inductive reasoning, so they start off with these questions, but then identify that what's common to all of those questions is that people rely on the internet to answer them. And then that allows them to proceed into making a case for why it's important to study how people address sources.
So they're using synthesis to create an exigence. And that's I think an important piece for students to recognize, is that that's one way to do that. What other instances of synthesis? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I had to run down the hall to my office and grab this book because it had to do with Mridula's comment, sorry, and
Go ahead.
I'm synthesizing. There you are. Yeah, but it was a really interesting point in this book that I've been sort of drawing on, kind of thinking about how I explain research to students. And it was talking about the difference stylistically, and they've drawn their work from corpus linguistics, which looks at patterns in different disciplines writing. And it was interesting, they say, the former, so they make a distinction between integral citations and non-integral. So the integral citations tend to focus the attention more on the researcher. So that's when so-and-so found, and that would be an example of the attributive language, as opposed to non-integral ones, which focus more on the research. and the idea that the research promoted as opposed to, so I mean, it's a kind of a really subtle difference in terms of thinking about how you're using language, but I mean, that kind of goes back to the point. That's always what I don't want to just give students a set of rules. I want to say, why are we doing it this way? There's a logic to it, and you need to think about why.
And this is what you can get for students from asking them to look closely at texts.
Yeah.
That is, if they're reading disciplinary text in your class, they can learn from paying close attention. What are the conventions in this discipline? How do we synthesize?
Right.
What does the language look like to do that? And so that was what I wanted you to experience and think about asking students to do. Is to use their texts that they're reading as mentor texts to help them think about their writing. And Graff and Birkenstein have this book, They Say, I Say, no relation, by the way, which is templates for different kinds of academic moves. I'll pass this around so you can take a look at it. But the part of the problem with this is that they're decontextualized, whereas actually looking in texts helps students to see how authors do this in your discipline. So I say, this is interesting, it can be useful. If you use it with care. So here's another way to think about helping students with synthesis, and that is with charts that guide them in analyzing the readings. If what they have to do in order to synthesize is analyze, you can guide them, you can have them take notes in ways that set them up to do the synthesis. So this first table, the one that says analysis table template, that comes from Judith's presentation, in which she was talking about evaluating sources by looking at all of these issues. But taking notes on articles in this way, or taking notes on sources in this way, can also provide the grounds for synthesizing.
Right.
Because once you have these notes, then you can look for patterns across the notes that you've taken on different texts.
And the one thing I'm thinking about this is, where do you do it in the process? Because I know, for example, when I'm teaching bilingualism, I usually have or multilingualism actually. I usually have about 4 different articles that kind of come at it from different perspectives, and then I have a chart, and I have the 4 authors across the chart, and I have terminology, and I said, as you encounter these words, think about how each of the authors defines these words, these terms. And the caveat to that is that they don't read the article, they just try to read the chart. So I sort of pulled back on that activity, one gentleman said, well, this really helped me understand what you're asking more, and what am I trying to understand. But then I found that it became perfunctory with some students.
So it depends on what you put on the chart.
Yeah.
If you're going to give them something like this, it's got to be okay that they fill out the chart. I mean, another way to do it is you ask students to read and annotate, and maybe give them the chart in class and have them complete it, so that they can go back to their reading and annotations, and then if the questions that you're asking on your chart are the questions that matter, then when they read the next article, they'll be sure to annotate about those questions.
Right.
So whatever you give students guides them in how to read whatever you're asking them to read.
I'm thinking maybe this would be useful when you send them to the library to start researching a topic, because they could just they could be able to read abstracts and at least get some of this, enough to know whether this is an art, it's a framework for looking at references, and kind of identifying how to select which might be appropriate for the topic they're playing with.
Yeah. On the other side, you have a more open way of doing this. So for instance, your point about the terms would be these different aspects, right? The terms would be the different aspects. But you could also ask questions like about, what's the impact of invasive species? What are the environmental conditions? So you can ask different aspects, different questions that focus on different aspects of the issue that readings have in common, and then ask students to take notes. And Hester, I said this was going to get back to your point earlier about students letting go of the article. If you have them take notes on a chart like this, as they proceed, they've got the notes on each of the previous articles, and then they just add to their chart. And then they're set up to look for patterns across the notes they've taken. And so I think that this kind of note-taking, if you're mindful about where you want students to end up and what you want students to pay attention to, can really set them up quite nicely for synthesis, because it's much easier to look at this and look for patterns than try to remember all the articles and look for patterns.
Absolutely.
And so this is a way that you can, and you can do it. So the one with the open, with the aspects of topics, you could do that. Either you set it early, you set the aspects of the topic, and in terms of scaffolding, in terms of releasing responsibility, you can have students come up with the aspects of the topic as they're reading. So they've got multiple tables, and they read one article, and they come up with certain categories that they put for that article. And then they read the next article, they might add categories, they might modify the categories. So it's an act of ongoing synthesis to complete the table. And then some other things that you can do are to break down the steps of the synthesis, so that they're not trying to do everything at once. The sort of key issue here is have them do the thinking, the analysis and synthesis before they try to actually write the paper that requires it. I mean, they'll learn more when they do the paper, but this is about diminishing the cognitive load.
Yeah.
If they're trying to find the patterns at the same time that they're trying to write the paper, their writing falls apart.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the more that and I would be very explicit with students that you are breaking out these skills that they're ultimately going to do unconsciously. That as they get a lot of practice, they won't have to go through all these steps every time. Although frankly, when I'm trying to write, I have to write summaries of all the articles I read, and then I go back and, to write a lit review, I go back and reread my summaries, because it's just too much for me to keep in my head.
I think it depends on the level of sophistication they're working. I mean, the more sophisticated the document they're working on, the more they're going to have to use this. So it's intuitive maybe on a short, one-page CBES test, but it's not. There's something more complicated, more sophisticated.
And then they have to practice. So lots of low stakes opportunities for them to do this, whether it's in classroom talk, whether it's in short papers, etc. But the more they practice, the better they'll get at it. And that practice will be active synthesis. So this book is a textbook. It's written for students. It's available freely online. And again, I will send you this so you'll have the link. And you could have students read chapters in this. You could read it to help inform your thinking about teaching. It's a wonderful book, The Informed Writer Using Sources in the Disciplines. And once you go to that website, wac.colostate.edu/books, you'll find there are lots of free books on there that you can use for yourself, for your students, that are, they're all PDF books, but it's a fantastic resource.